The night was thick with the smell of molasses and the damp air of the Carolina lowlands. The year was 1823, and the world of the plantation stretched endlessly into the horizon. Miles of swaying cane and cotton under a moon that cast silver shadows across the fields. At the center of it all stood the big house, a monument to power and cruelty, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes over the people who toiled endlessly in the soil below. It was a world ruled by silence, except for the crack of a whip. A world where the cries of the enslaved dissolved into the humid night, swallowed by the cicadas, and carried away by the wind as if the land itself was tired of listening. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. Inside that house lived Jonathan Barrow, a man whose name carried the weight of fear among both his peers and his captives. Barrow was not the largest plantation owner in South Carolina, but his reputation made him infamous. He believed in ownership not just of bodies but of souls, convinced that every life on his land existed for his will alone. His wealth flowed from cane, cotton, and blood, a fortune built on suffering, and in that house, under Barrow's iron rule, was his daughter, Margaret. She was 19 years old, heavy in stature, and burdened not only by her weight, but by the shame her father carried because of it. In a society where appearances were everything, Margaret was his failure made flesh, the daughter he could not marry off. The embarrassment whispered about at church gatherings, the reminder that even his fortune and influence could not shape her into what he desired. The resentment festered. Each meal she ate was another insult in her father's eyes. Each laugh of townsfolk behind their fans, another wound to his pride. And so, in his bitterness, Barrow conceived a punishment that would satisfy not just his cruelty, but his hunger for dominance. He would do something unthinkable, not to his enemies, but to his own blood. The enslaved whispered of it long before it happened. Rumors trickled through the quarters like water through cracked earth. They spoke of how Master Barrow had chosen one of them, a man of strength, whose back bore the scars of a dozen whippings, whose spirit had not yet been broken. His name was Josiah. Josiah had been born into chains. He had known no world beyond the boundaries of the plantation, but within him lived a fire that refused to be extinguished. He carried himself with quiet dignity, even as the lash cut his skin. He worked with precision, built with muscle, and endured with silence. The others looked to him, not as a leader in open defiance, but as a reminder that a man could still carry his soul intact even when his body was owned. Barrow saw that strength, and he despised it. To a man like him, dignity in a slave was a challenge, a shadow of rebellion. And now, he had found the perfect way to twist it into humiliation. The plan was whispered into existence one night after supper, when Barrow sat at the head of the dining table, his glass of bourbon catching the candlelight. Margaret sat opposite him, her plate still piled with untouched food, her face pale under the weight of her father's gaze. "You are a disgrace to this family," Barrow spat, his voice like poison honey, "and I will not bear it any longer. You will be dealt with tomorrow." The servants in the room froze, their hands trembling as they cleared the dishes. None dared to ask what he meant. None needed to. His cruelty had no limits. That night the quarters buzzed with unease. The enslaved had learned to read the winds of the big house, and something dark was moving. Mothers held their children closer, old men muttered prayers, and Josiah sat alone at the edge of the quarters, staring at the silhouette of the house against the moon. He did not yet know the role Barrow had chosen for him, but he felt the tightening of fate around his chest. Morning came heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down like a hand against the back of the neck. Josiah was summoned to the big house, his calloused hands still caked with the soil of the fields. He stood at the threshold, hat in hand, sweat trickling down his brow, while Barrow looked upon him with a grin that carried no warmth. "You're a strong one," Barrow said slowly, circling him like a predator sizing its prey. "Strong in body, strong in spirit, but let us see how strong you remain when I place a burden upon you." Margaret was brought into the room then, her eyes red from tears, her body trembling though she tried to stand tall. She looked at Josiah, not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with a shame so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. She had heard her father's command. She knew what was to come. Barrow's voice cut the silence like a blade. "She is yours. Do with her as I command. And remember, Josiah, her disgrace will be your disgrace if you fail. Her shame will be your shame. What you do to her body will remind you that you are nothing but what I make you." The words hung heavy, venomous, impossible. Josiah felt the room close in around him, the weight of chains tightening, though no iron bound him at that moment. Margaret lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes, her hands clenched at her sides. She too was a prisoner, though gilded in lace and bloodline. It was a cruelty that went beyond the whip. This was not just punishment. It was desecration of Josiah's dignity, of Margaret's humanity, of everything that bound flesh to soul. And in that moment, Josiah made a choice. He did not know yet what it meant or where it would lead, but deep within, a vow was carved into his spirit that whatever Barrow thought he owned, there was a part of him that would never be touched. The day ended with silence, but the air was thick with the unspoken. Margaret retreated to her chambers, her sobs muffled behind a locked door. Josiah returned to the quarters, his face unreadable, his body trembling with a storm that could not yet break. The others watched him, waiting for a word, a sign, anything, but he said nothing. Night fell again, darker than before. The stars hid behind clouds as if ashamed to witness what had been set into motion. And as Josiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin, he knew that the days to come would test not only his strength, but the very essence of his humanity. For cruelty had taken a new form, and it was only beginning. Inside the big house, Margaret had not slept. Her chamber smelled of perfume and wilted roses, an attempt to mask the stench of fear that clung to her. She sat at the vanity, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. Her hair was brushed, her gown laced, her figure pressed into corset stays that could not disguise her size. Her father's words echoed endlessly in her skull. "You are a disgrace." For years, Margaret had tried to please him, attending social gatherings, forcing laughter, enduring the cruel whispers of neighboring daughters, yet no charm nor effort could erase her father's shame. She had grown up trapped in a cage built not of iron, but of judgment, its bars thicker with every passing year. Now, the cage was collapsing upon her, crushing what little self-worth she had left. She whispered to her reflection, her voice trembling, "Is this who I am? Is this what I've become?" Tears fell onto her bodice, staining the lace. But before she could wipe them away, the heavy tread of boots echoed down the hall. The door burst open. Jonathan Barrow entered without knocking, his presence filling the room like smoke. He carried the scent of whiskey and the iron authority of a man who knew no restraint. He looked at his daughter not with love nor pity, but with disdain sharpened to a blade. "Today," he growled, "you will learn obedience, and so will he." Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "Father, please, do not." Silence. His hand cracked against the vanity, rattling the glass. "Your pleas mean nothing. You will serve a purpose, if not as a daughter, then as a lesson." Down in the quarters, Josiah worked silently, though his body moved with the precision of a man carving every gesture into memory. His axe fell against the woodpile, each strike an outlet for the storm inside him. He felt the eyes of the others on him, men and women who had heard whispers of Barrow's command, who waited to see if Josiah's spirit would shatter or stand. By midday, Josiah was summoned again. 2 overseers came for him, their whips coiled at their sides, their faces lit with cruel anticipation. They marched him across the yard, past the rows of cane, past the rows of trembling onlookers who pretended not to watch. The big house loomed larger with every step, its white columns gleaming like the teeth of a predator. When Josiah entered, he was led to the parlor. There stood Barrow, Margaret beside him, her hands trembling so violently she could barely keep them clasped. Barrow's voice boomed. "This is no mere whim, Josiah. This is a command. You will take what I give you. You will do as I say, and you will remember that I own you." Josiah met his gaze with eyes like steel. He did not speak. Words would have been useless, twisted into submission by Barrow's power. Instead, he stood tall, silent, and burning. Barrow sneered. "Strong, aren't you? We shall see how strong you remain when you're made to touch what disgusts even her own blood." Margaret flinched at the words, her cheeks blazing red with humiliation. She wanted to scream, to flee, to vanish into nothingness, but she stood frozen, trapped by the chains of blood and expectation. Barrow turned sharply to his daughter. "Look at him. Look at the slave who will know you as no gentleman ever will. That is what you've brought upon yourself." Margaret's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Her eyes met Josiah's for a fleeting moment, a moment where pain, shame, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not desire. It was not recognition. It was the tragic acknowledgement of two souls bound by a cruelty neither had chosen. The overseers closed in, one placing a heavy hand on Josiah's shoulder, the other readying the whip should he resist. The room was thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and unspoken violence. Barrow's voice dropped to a hiss. "Do it, or you will watch every man, woman, and child in those quarters suffer for your defiance." The threat hung heavier than the air itself. Josiah's heart thundered in his chest. He knew the truth of it. Barrow had burned men alive for less. He had whipped children until their mothers fainted at the sound. He was a man who wielded cruelty as casually as others drew breath. And so Josiah stood at the precipice of a choice that was no choice at all. To resist was to condemn his people. To submit was to condemn himself. Margaret's breath hitched. She whispered, so soft it almost disappeared, "Please." But whether she begged for mercy, for release, or for death, none could tell. Josiah closed his eyes. His mind raced to the memories of his mother, a face he had barely known, a lullaby half remembered in the shadows of infancy. He thought of the land before the chains, the stories whispered by elders of a homeland beyond the ocean, where men stood free. And in that darkness behind his closed eyes, he made another vow. "If my body must be broken, my spirit will not." The overseer's whip cracked against the floor. "Now!" Josiah opened his eyes, meeting Margaret's with a gaze that did not falter. She trembled, her lips quivering, her soul collapsing under the humiliation forced upon her. She was both victim and symbol, the instrument of her father's hatred and the target of his cruelty. Barrow leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon with satisfaction. He thought himself a god, watching as the pawns he commanded moved upon the board. He could not imagine that in his cruelty he was sowing the seeds of a storm greater than his own house. For in that room, beneath the crushing weight of his power, something unspoken bound Josiah and Margaret, not love, not desire, but a recognition of shared suffering, a recognition that would ignite consequences Barrow could not yet see. The moment stretched into eternity. Sweat trickled down Josiah's brow. Margaret's breath came shallow and uneven. The overseer's hands twitched with anticipation. And then, a sound shattered the stillness. From outside, a scream pierced the air. High, shrill, desperate. It was a woman's voice, carried from the quarters, cut short by the crack of a whip. Josiah's head turned sharply, his heart seizing. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Barrow's face twisted with fury at the interruption. He stood, slamming his glass onto the table. "What now?" he roared. The overseers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to release Josiah or hold him tighter. The scream came again, echoing like a warning, like a cry from the very earth itself. And in that moment, as Barrow stormed toward the door, Josiah felt the tightening grip of destiny. Something was happening beyond the walls of that room, something that could shatter the fragile balance of power. The air was thick, charged, waiting. And Josiah knew. Whatever cruelty Barrow had planned for him and Margaret was only the beginning of a storm that would consume them all. And now her cry had been cut short. Barrow turned from the parlor door with a scowl that twisted his face into something monstrous. "Keep him here," he snarled at the overseers. "I will deal with this." Margaret flinched as her father's boots thundered out of the room, his shadow lingering long after he was gone. She looked to Josiah, eyes wide, as if silently begging for something she could not name. Her hands trembled so violently that the lace at her cuffs shook like leaves in the wind. Josiah stood still, the overseer's grip heavy on his arms, but inside him a storm surged. Ruth's cry had pierced more than the air. It had pierced the dam within him that he had fought so long to keep sealed. Every scar on his back, every night of hunger, every prayer whispered into the dirt came rushing back with the sound of her pain. Margaret's lips parted. "What is happening out there?" she whispered, her voice thin and breaking. Neither overseer answered. They stood stiff, shifting uneasily, their eyes darting toward the door. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The silence beyond the walls was louder than the scream itself. Something was moving in the quarters, something that should not have been possible under the crushing heel of Barrow's reign. Finally, footsteps returned, heavy, rapid. And then Barrow reappeared. His face was flushed with rage, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with the fury of a man who had been challenged. "She thought she could defy me," he spat, slamming the door behind him. His hand was stained dark, whether from wine, dirt, or blood, none could tell. "But I silenced her. Let it be a lesson to every last one of them." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Father, what have you done?" Barrow's gaze snapped to her, and for a moment even his daughter recoiled as though the devil himself had turned his eyes upon her. "I have done what is necessary. Mercy breeds rebellion. Fear keeps them in line." Josiah's eyes burned with unspoken rage, but his face remained carved from stone. Barrow noticed, and a twisted smile crept across his lips. "You hear me, boy?" he sneered. "Your people suffer when you resist. Every time you stand tall, every time you pretend you have dignity, I will break another of them, and you will carry that weight." Josiah said nothing, but his silence was not submission. It was defiance, the kind that boiled quietly, unseen, waiting for its moment to strike. Barrow turned on his heel, pointing to Margaret with the authority of a judge condemning the guilty. "Now, enough of these delays. She is yours. Do what I command, or you will hear their screams until your soul begs for death." Margaret shook her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Father, please, not like this. I beg you." "Silence," Barrow thundered. "You shame me further with every word. You are no daughter of mine until you are broken and remade. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Josiah, "will be the hammer." The overseers tightened their grip on Josiah's arms. The room was suffocating with tension. Margaret sobbed openly now, clutching her gown as though it could shield her from her father's command. Josiah closed his eyes once more, steadying himself. He thought of Ruth, her scream, her silence, her courage. He thought of the others in the quarters who watched him now not with judgment, but with desperate hope. Whatever choice he made in this moment would not be his alone. It would ripple, outward, binding every life around him to its consequences. The whip cracked again, not upon him, not upon Margaret, but against the parlor floor. A warning, a countdown. Barrow's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Obey, or I will burn this place to the ground with every one of them inside." Margaret collapsed to her knees, her sobs choking the air. "Please, God, no." Josiah's heart thundered in his chest. His body trembled under the overseer's grip. His soul screamed for freedom, for vengeance, for something greater than this endless cycle of cruelty. And then, from outside, another sound rose. Not a scream this time, but a murmur, low at first, then growing. Voices, dozens of them, the voices of the enslaved, rising together in something that had not been heard on the plantation in years. They were singing, a spiritual, deep and defiant, carried through the night air like fire catching dry grass. It was a song of sorrow, of bondage, but also of hope, a reminder of a world beyond the chains. The overseers froze. Margaret lifted her head in shock. Even Barrow stiffened, his face twisting with a rare flicker of unease. The song grew louder, stronger, a chorus of voices shaking the walls of the big house, drowning out the whip, defying the silence. Josiah's eyes snapped open, his chest rising with renewed fire. He met Barrow's gaze, and for the first time, the master faltered under the weight of a slave's stare. The overseer's hands trembled on Josiah's arms. Margaret clutched the floor, her tears mingling with a strange, flickering hope, and, in that charged, impossible moment, the air itself seemed to whisper that the tide was turning. For the song outside was not just a hymn, it was a signal that the night of suffering might soon give birth to fire. Barrow's face darkened, his lips pulled tight in rage. He spun toward the window, listening to the swelling hymn. "Silence them," he barked at the overseers. "Whips, guns, whatever it takes, end this blasphemy." But the overseers hesitated. For the first time, hesitation cracked their obedience. They heard the song, too. It was not the trembling chorus of broken spirits. It was a roar in disguise. Barrow's eyes narrowed, fury boiling in his veins. "Do it!" he thundered. Before they could move, another sound pierced the night, the sharp, explosive crack of gunfire. Then another. Shouts followed, not of overseers commanding, but of men and women rising in defiance. The hymn dissolved into chaos, the sound of running feet, of shouted orders, of metal striking flesh. Barrow froze for a heartbeat, the realization dawning. It was not a hymn of mourning. It had been a signal. The quarters had risen. Josiah felt the overseer's grip loosen in their shock. His eyes burned with the fire of that realization. Ruth's scream had not been the end. It had been the spark. The enslaved had chosen this night, this moment, when their chains rattled the loudest, to break them. Margaret clutched the hem of her gown, staring in terror at her father. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Barrow spun on her, his face twisted with fury. "Rebellion," he spat. "Your disgrace has brought this on us all." "No," Margaret gasped, shaking her head violently. "This is not me." But her words were cut short as a thunderous pounding rattled the doors of the big house. Shouts echoed outside, shouts and voices Barrow was used to silencing. The overseers drew their whips nervously, glancing at one another. They were few. The quarters held many. And tonight, fear had shifted its balance. Josiah's chest swelled as he listened to the chaos beyond. His people, the people Barrow believed broken, had risen. Their voices, their cries, their courage filled the night. He felt the overseer's hand slacken just slightly, and in that moment, centuries of rage surged through his veins. With a roar, Josiah twisted free, his fist crashing into the jaw of the nearest overseer. The man crumpled like a felled tree. The second swung his whip, but Josiah caught it mid-air, yanking the man forward and driving his knee into his chest. Margaret shrieked, stumbling backward, her hands clutched to her chest. Barrow turned, shock flashing across his features. "You dare!" But Josiah was already moving, his body fueled by fury, his spirit by fire. He stood tall, towering, whip clenched in his hand. For the first time in his life, he faced Barrow not as property, not as prisoner, but as man to man. Barrow's face twisted into something grotesque, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I own you," he thundered. "You are mine." Josiah's voice, deep and steady, cut through the chaos like a blade. "No man owns me." The pounding at the doors grew louder, the shouts nearer. Somewhere, glass shattered. The house trembled with the weight of the uprising outside. Barrow's hand darted to the pistol at his hip. His movements were fast, practiced, fueled by years of violence. But Josiah was faster. The whip cracked through the air, coiling around Barrow's wrist. With a violent pull, Josiah wrenched the pistol free and sent it clattering to the floor. Margaret gasped, frozen between terror and awe. She looked from her father to Josiah, her mind unraveling as the world she knew collapsed before her eyes. Barrow snarled, lunging forward, but Josiah planted his foot and shoved him back. The master stumbled, his face colliding with the edge of the table. Blood streaked his brow. The voices outside drew nearer, the pounding now shaking the very frame of the house. Barrow staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with hate. "You think they will save you?" he spat. "You think you'll live to see the morning?" Josiah said nothing. His silence was heavier than words. Barrow lunged again, but before he could reach Josiah, the parlor doors burst open. The enslaved poured in. Men and women, their faces lit by firelight, their hands armed with tools turned to weapons, hoes, axes, knives, and torches. Their eyes burned with the fury of generations. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Barrow stared at them, stunned, as though the very earth had betrayed him. Margaret clutched the table, trembling, unable to breathe. And Josiah stood in their center, whip in hand, his chest rising with the rhythm of their defiance. The house was no longer Barrow's. The night was no longer his. The world in this moment belonged to those who had once been chained. But rebellion comes with blood, and the first drop had yet to fall. Jonathan Barrow, standing bloodied and furious in the middle of his parlor, looked upon them as if they were vermin breaching his temple. His chest heaved, his lips curled in disgust, his eyes wild. He had built this house on their backs, filled its walls with the fruits of their suffering, and now those same walls bore witness to his undoing. "You dare," he roared, spittle flying from his mouth. "You dare bring fire into my house? You dare raise a hand against me?" But his voice, which once commanded obedience, fell into the air like stones into the sea. No one moved. No one answered. His power, so absolute in his mind, dissolved before their gaze. Josiah stepped forward from their ranks, whip still coiled in his hand, his presence tall and unshakable. His eyes locked on Barrow's, steady and unwavering. "You burned us," Josiah said at last, his voice deep, resonant, carrying the weight of centuries. "You broke us. You took everything. And now the fire is yours." Barrow's face twisted. His hand groped desperately for the pistol he had lost, but one of the rebels kicked it across the floor, sending it clattering uselessly into the corner. Margaret stood frozen, pressed against the wall, her breath ragged, her body trembling. She looked from her father's rage to the faces of the enslaved, faces she had seen her entire life, faces she had passed without acknowledgement, faces she had once thought beneath her. Now those faces burned with fury, and she realized for the first time that her silks and lace could not shield her. She was no longer mistress of this house. She was as trapped as her father. "Seize him!" cried a voice from the crowd. A rush of bodies surged forward. Barrow fought like a madman, swinging his fists, snarling, bellowing curses that turned to animal howls. He landed a blow against one man's jaw, shoved another back into the wall. His strength was real, born from years of domination, but it was nothing against the tide that engulfed him. Hands clawed at him. Weapons struck, and he went down beneath the weight of those he had once called property. His screams filled the parlor, louder than the hymn, louder than the fire, a sound of power crumbling in its final moments. Margaret covered her ears, tears streaming down her cheeks. She could not watch, yet she could not look away. Her father's voice, the same voice that had commanded her life, that had called her shame, that had shaped her into a creature of obedience, was breaking into something unrecognizable. And then, silence. The mob parted, their chests heaving, their hands streaked with blood. On the floor lay Jonathan Barrow, his body twisted, his face slack, his eyes staring glassy into nothing. The master of the plantation, the tyrant of countless lives, lay still upon the boards of his own parlor. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of torches. The enslaved stood over his body, their breaths heavy, their expressions unreadable. It was done, yet in the weight of the silence, the enormity of it pressed down on them all. Josiah stood above the corpse, whip hanging loosely at his side. He looked down at Barrow not with triumph, but with something deeper, more sorrowful. This was not victory. It was necessity. Margaret pressed her back harder against the wall, clutching her bodice as if her heart might break through her ribs. Her eyes darted to Josiah, to the crowd, to her father's lifeless form. She wanted to scream, but the sound would not come. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move. And then, all eyes turned to her. The torches flickered, casting her in a wavering orange glow. She felt the weight of their gaze press upon her, heavier than the corset around her chest. She was Barrow's daughter. She bore his name, his blood, his legacy. Whispers rose among the crowd. What of her? She is his. She carries his poison. Margaret's lips trembled. She pressed herself tighter into the corner, shaking her head, whispering, "No, please, no." Josiah raised a hand, and the room fell silent. He looked at her, his face unreadable. The overseers lay unconscious on the floor. The master was dead. Now only she remained, a question, a symbol, a danger. Margaret's tears streaked her cheeks, her voice cracking in desperation. I am not him. I am not him, the crowd murmured again. Some faces hardened, others softened with hesitation. Justice demanded blood, but was hers the price? Josiah's eyes locked on hers, searching, weighing. He saw the trembling figure before him, not the master's equal, not his accomplice, but his prisoner in another form. A gilded captive bound by different chains. Still, he did not lower his hand. His voice, low and steady, filled the parlor. The master is gone, but his blood remains. The crowd hushed, waiting for his word, waiting for judgment. Margaret collapsed to her knees, sobbing openly now, her hands outstretched. Please, I beg you, have mercy. The flames outside crackled louder, the uprising still raging beyond the parlor walls. The plantation was falling piece by piece. But in this moment, all of it hung upon one choice, hers, his, theirs. Josiah's breath came slow, steady. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them, gaze sharp as a blade. The question, he said softly, though every ear caught it, is whether mercy will save us or destroy us. The torches flickered. The silence deepened. Margaret trembled at the center of their gaze, the weight of their vengeance pressing upon her like a noose. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rose. Spare her, and she will betray us. Another answered, kill her, and we become him. The debate broke like thunder. Voices clashed, cries rang out, arguments seared the air. The enslaved were not of one mind. Mercy and justice battled in their throats. And at the center stood Margaret, her sobs drowning in the roar of judgment. Josiah lifted his hand again, his voice booming over them all. Enough! The room fell silent. He looked once more at Margaret, her pale face streaked with tears, her hands clutching at the floor as though it could swallow her whole. And then he spoke the words that would decide her fate. But before he could finish, the sound of boots thundered from the hall. The front doors of the house burst open. Men with rifles stormed inside. Militia, neighbors, called by the glow of fire across the plantation sky. The night of freedom had found its reckoning. The plantation lay in ruins. What had once been a sprawling empire of wealth and cruelty was now reduced to blackened earth, smoldering beams, and the faint echo of screams carried away by the wind. The dawn broke with an unnatural stillness, the kind that follows great violence. The fields, once filled with rows of cotton, stood abandoned, stalks bent, soil scarred, a graveyard for dreams and lives alike. The daughter, the one whose body had been a symbol of both her father's indulgence and her own silent torment, had not been seen since the flames consumed the house. Some whispered she perished in the fire, swallowed by the very walls that had imprisoned her spirit. Others claimed they saw her running into the fields, barefoot, dress torn, a phantom wandering into the morning mist. But whether dead or alive, her presence was no longer tied to that cursed estate. The enslaved who had suffered under the lash of the overseer and the iron will of the master stood at the edge of the ruins. Their chains, though still heavy in the laws of men, had been shattered in spirit. For the first time in memory, they looked upon the ashes not with despair, but with something dangerously close to freedom. They had witnessed cruelty unimaginable, endured degradations too deep for words, but they had also watched the house, that symbol of their torment, collapse in on itself, devoured by fire. It was as though the land itself demanded reckoning. The father, the plantation owner, once feared and revered in equal measure, was gone. Some claimed he was cut down by those he had enslaved, justice carried out with trembling yet determined hands. Others believed he fled into the woods, a coward stripped of his empire, destined to wander as a shadow of the tyrant he once was. History would not remember him kindly, for his sins had already carved themselves into the very soil he had stained with blood. But the slave he had chosen, the man forced into the most unspeakable of roles, he stood at the center of it all. His back still bore the scars of whips, his eyes still carried the storm of rage and grief, but now there was something else there too, a weight lifted, though not erased. He had not asked for vengeance, but it had found him. He had not chosen to be entangled in the family's grotesque cruelty, yet he had become the final witness to their undoing. He walked through the charred remains of the great hall, The chandeliers that once glittered in candlelight had melted into twisted iron. The grand piano sat broken, keys scattered across the floor like teeth ripped from a jaw. And on the mantel, blackened but still faintly visible, was a portrait, the plantation owner, his daughter seated beside him, their faces painted in the false dignity of wealth. The canvas had bubbled and cracked from the heat, their smiles distorted into grotesque masks. He turned away, unable to bear it any longer. The world outside was changing. The winds of war and abolition were sweeping across the South, and though freedom was still distant, its whisper had grown louder. The destruction of this house was more than just the end of one family's reign of cruelty. It was a symbol of what was coming. An empire built on human suffering could not last forever. The daughter's fate remained a haunting question. Some who survived claimed that, in her final moments, she had turned against her father, screaming at him, clawing at him, as though all the years of silence had erupted into one desperate act of defiance. Others insisted she had been consumed by madness long before the fire, and that the flames had merely finished what her father began. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. Perhaps she, too, was a victim trapped in a cage of flesh and expectation, her body weaponized against her will. The man, the enslaved who had borne the brunt of their cruelty, left the ruins behind him. He did not look back. The others followed, not as slaves trailing behind, but as survivors walking toward something unknown. Their steps were slow, cautious, but every stride carried the weight of centuries and the faint glimmer of tomorrow. And as the sun rose higher, burning away the fog, the plantation disappeared into memory. Its story would live on, whispered in hushed tones, recounted as a warning, a legend of fire and reckoning. The land would heal, but it would never forget. Because what had been done there, to bodies, to souls, to innocence itself, could never be erased. It could only serve as a reminder that cruelty unchecked becomes rot, that power wielded without mercy consumes itself, and that even the mightiest houses, no matter how grand their pillars, will crumble when built on suffering. The man paused at the tree line, looking back one last time at the smoke curling into the sky. For years that house had been his cage, his torment, his burden. Now it was nothing but ash. He whispered, barely audible over the rustle of the leaves, "Never again." And with that, he stepped forward into a world uncertain, but at last, his own.